Thank you. Good morning, everyone. We're happy to see you today. We were with you yesterday, and this is just a beautiful prolongation of what we experienced yesterday, the wonderful celebration of our BIGSAS Journalist Award winners for 2024. So just 2 or 3 words about the BIGSAS Journalist Award. It started in 2011 and with the initiative of the Bayreuth International Graduate School of African Studies, which is now housed under the Cluster of Excellence Africa Multiple Cluster of Excellence. We are happy to have you here today, and the BIGSAS Journalist Award actually encourages beautiful, wonderful authorship about the African continent without the cliché, stereotype kind of reporting that we see, especially on the media, on television, and we also listen to on radio. And today with us, we have our winners. You are already familiar with them. We have Birte Mensing, our winner for this year's BIGSAS Journalist Award. So Birte has also been living in Kenya and is now back in Bayreuth, you did say, and she's been working on issues on the African continent and beyond, and also as a scholar. We want to welcome you today to this beautiful and wonderful roundtable that we have. And of course, our second place winner, together with Bettina Rue, we have our wonderful Ruona Meyer, who is a Nigerian German, also now venturing into scholarship, and a journalist as our second place winner for this year's Journalist Award. Welcome.
Thank you. Yeah, welcome also from my side. I'm very happy to be here and with the 2 winners on stage. And together with Billion, we will sort of guide you through this morning, which is basically an opportunity for the various jury members to exchange with the journalists. It would be too much to introduce every jury member individually, because you have very fascinating biographies. So I will just say the names of the many people that have read your work and looked through them. There is Yakuba Baoro, the president of the jury, Sevi Dudunu, Erika Dalmans, Lamine Doumbia, Mbai Sey, Elżbieta Zwlablova, Cassandra Mark-Thiessen, Georg Materna, Louise Ndong, Simon Nganga, Germaine Yada, Jennifer Scheffler, and of course, Bilian Utundu. When you ask your questions, so there will be a microphone that goes through the room and will be handed to you. Maybe you can quickly introduce yourselves. So that we also know where you're coming from, what you do, what you found perhaps interesting with regards to the articles, and we can get into a conversation. The way that we thought about this is that we have different guiding blocks, different questions. So we will start with an overall introductory question so that you can also get the chance to say a little bit about the article that you wrote. But then we'll talk about journalism in and on Africa, questions of audiences, stereotypes, and impact. And then we will turn to questions of your experiences, best practices that you would like to share, to then finally ask questions about overall the relation between African studies and journalism, which is the main topic today. And with that, I hand over to Bilian.
So we start with our first session of just introduction about yourselves and what motivated you especially to start writing or addressing these topics that you did for us.
You are the first place winner. Thank you. So should I just talk? Okay. So yeah, I mean, I've met most of you now. My name is Birte, and my first journalism experience on the African continent was quite a few years ago. After high school, I was in Cameroon for a year, in Bamenda. And at the end of the Weltwärts voluntary year that I did there, I spent like my last weeks when it was summer holidays at a small radio station. And yeah, kind of got taught and got introduced into radio reporting. And that's kind of where it started. Then I went back to Germany, I studied, I continued writing, and then went to journalism school and did my last practical in journalism school in the German TV studio in Nairobi. And that's what later brought me back to Nairobi when they had an opening there. And that's kind of how I ended up in Nairobi now, doing what I really like doing, moving around, meeting people who kind of, who are convinced that what they do is important, who inspire, and after a lot of encounters I have the feeling kind of that my own motivation in doing what I'm doing gets kind of enforced through meeting people who are really committed to what they do, and then trying to contribute a little bit to that by getting messages out to audiences that might otherwise not hear about what the people that I've met are doing.
So for me, the way I got into journalism is through genetics. In my case, journalism is genetically transmitted. My father was a journalist. Unfortunately, was killed for being a journalist in Nigeria. I had tried to be different things, a banker, in the communications department, and it didn't work out, needless to say. I have always been interested in telling stories. I think I became forced to tell some type of stories because I was working in South Africa and I was working on business stories, but then there are social stories happening. And so as an African, as a person actually, I felt, I don't think I want to be talking about the price of corn as a commodity when there are people that don't even have corn to eat. And so that's where I willfully decided to focus on social stories, as I call them. The main particular reason why I did this story is, as I go on, I've started to notice as an immigrant that we need stories that serve not just our European brothers and sisters, but also serve Africans in diaspora as well, while taking care of the narrative at home. So this particular story all started when I came across somebody being so happy that their child in France was going to be eating a chebudien, which is like Senegalese jollof rice, in a jar. And I was like, oh, I wish I had that when I was a baby. And I discovered that this person was trying to serve a market and was relying heavily on social media. So when the time came for us to talk about using technology to solve SDG goals and what we can learn, I remember that there was a German baby food provider who had failed because they, by their own admission, could not use social media to market properly. And that's where the idea for the story came. I knew I could not sit down in Germany and do this story, especially because the German refused to talk to me. So I flew into Senegal, stayed there for quite some time, went to the farms where the women were, talked to the founder as well. But one interesting thing was this story would not be possible without the academics that I found were actually already working on this. And I think that is what leads into why we're here today. So it was another reminder for me that I wouldn't have had that access to think that way or to introduce these unsung academics if I wasn't an academic myself. And so the academics made me really think differently, especially the one that said they are socializing tech, and tech does not have to work for does not have to work in, he said it this way, tech does not have to work in the language of the creator. It should work in the language of the user. And that's exactly what our Senegalese folks were doing. And so that's why I did that story, because I wanted to straddle diaspora audiences, Africans at home, while still speaking to us Germans. And I think the highlight for me was when a school used that story in their lessons. That told me that there would be young children who would at least have an idea. And so to now also be awarded for it, mind blown. Thank you.
Yeah, I think we will get back to these questions, because both of you are also, you're not only journalists, but you're also in a very strong relation. You're doing your PhD on investigative journalism. You, as we have heard yesterday, are also part of a program of Pan-Africanist thought on African politics in London. So I think we are cousins in a way, that we are very similar in the ways in which we work, and this is what makes this conversation interesting. We'll get back to that, but perhaps before, I would like to know what your perception of journalism on or in Africa is currently, and how the field might have changed. And this is then also an invitation to all of you to ask your questions. Don't be shy, we're a small group here. The background is, so there was recently, for instance, there was a call about the media landscape in Germany, and that only 10% of news coverage is on the global south, and Africa obviously taking an even smaller percentage. Do you feel like things are changing, or do you feel like we're at the very beginning of change if we're optimistic? What is your take on the current media landscape in Germany?
It's interesting because I have the feeling, because I haven't been in Germany for the last years, I'm kind of, on the one hand, I don't have a good overview of like what a German audience perceives in media on a daily basis. But I mean, I do meet other colleagues who are reporting quite a lot, either in Nairobi or also in other reporting trips. And I do think that it's not only about like the amount of reporting, but also about like the approach to the reporting, and the approach reporters have, and the approach editors have. And I do think that there is a kind of, or that there can be a shift in the approach, because I think over the last decades it has still been very much like the correspondent comes and explains things, kind of. And I think there is a shift towards more letting people explain, kind of just being the intermediary. Like, at least that's what I try to do. And I think there's more people, especially like in the younger generation, who are kind of taking a different approach in reporting. But then at the same time, what does make it more difficult or complicated is that especially, newspapers have no money. There's a bit more money in radio and TV, but it is difficult to kind of find funding for reporting trips. So a lot of funding for reporting trip comes from, for example, from foundations or scholarships, grants, and a lot of them come from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation at some point. And that's a thing that is important to discuss and to have in mind, and to see like, how do we want this as a society? Is it okay that it only depends on like private sponsoring, or like how do we want to look at this? And yeah, I think that's an important part in how the reporting can actually happen. And then
So I'm going to be speaking from the information I've gotten and the experiences I've had on juries over the years. So that would be juries deciding on prizes across Europe. That would also be my experience as a grant manager, and also meeting grantors in Europe. that focus on the global south? And the answer is this. Reporting on the global south in Germany especially is actually on the rise. It's just not in mainstream media. It's not done by mainstream legacy media, which is the media that is appraised, that is researched mainly for the figures we're getting. Okay, so we don't have the full story. And I can say this confidently because, for example, let me give an example. When I sit on a jury for European grants, about 60% of the applicants are Germans. They are in teams with colleagues in the global south, reporting on stories that cover both Germany and the global south. But they are digital outlets, for example. They are outlets that operate from exile, for example. They are not the ones that are surveyed, okay? And I think that's, of course, where academics can step in to make the picture broader. So I'm not worried about, from what I see, and the bulk of people you see at conferences. So I'm a conference rat, so to speak, for journalism. I'm either in a conference here or there as an attendee or speaking or something. And also from what we see, there is a focus. Okay, we had the first Mental Health in Journalism Summit last month. The focus was also, there was also the Global South, you know, in there. I'm not worried about it. What I am worried about, though, is the fact that these people do not get seen, which is why they don't make it into mainstream research or discussions, for example. And I think that's where we can all step in. I think I'm taking from this now, I need to do better to talk about how it's opening up, the space is opening up. But I will say in digital outlets, that is not newspapers. In the newsroom, the global desks of even mainstream outlets, more reporting is focusing on there. More funding is actually going on there compared to 2 years ago, for example. So I wouldn't be worried. I would instead be worried about, you know, why are we not seeing more? Why are we not talking about what fails or what succeeds in these types of collaborations? So there's an increase. Can we do with more money? Yes. They need more money because it's more expensive, as you know. But there's an increase, especially in Germany. Germany is actually one of the strongest countries where journalists collaborate outside and report on outside stories. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Are there questions from the audience in this regard? Or comments?
Yeah, I think comments would be interesting. Also, how do you perceive reporting that, like, when you just consume regular media, like what kind of reporting on the continent reaches your attention and what not? And yeah.
The way this works is we can hand you the microphone. You don't even have to get up.
Should we call on you?
You know a few names.
And plus, they all read at least 50 articles in recent times, so they have a good overview.
Sorry about that.
No, but I think this aspect of like collaboration in reporting, and also, I think in the, like, let's say like 20, 30 years ago, I wasn't in the field, but from what I've heard, it was much more like kind of that journalists work with local stringers or fixers who, and then the story is, but then only credited to the, let's say, white journalist or the European journalist. And I think that's changing. Like journalists are actually like partnering, especially because of grants. You can apply together and it's more like we do the story together and then maybe each write for different media outlets, but like the research is being done together, things are being credited for everyone who's participating, and I think that's an important step because, yeah, I mean, it's impossible to do a lot of stories on my own, and it's like this step towards transparency.
Okay, I'm particularly interested in the journalism that's done by people in exile, which was mentioned before, and other such like non-mainstream sources. For an academic who's potentially interested in looking at these, what would be some of your tips for finding or uncovering these sources? Because they're not, like you can't do a regular Google search and just find it. So what would be some of your tips or suggestions for accessing such?
First of all, you must do that topic, okay? I'm going to stalk you. But I think you should start with mict.org. It's Media Incorporation and Transition in Germany. I've done some training for them, and they're very heavy on exile journalists. Very heavy on exile entities, especially those that cover the Global South. Please contact them. If you need me to do an introduction, I'm also okay to do that. But right on their website, they have information. They actually offer shelter as well for some journalists that are directly under threat. They provide training for those journalists, how to integrate and continue reporting. There is also, I think the name, ANA Bracos. Anna, I forget the actual name because it's not in German or English, but you know they cover the Balkan states, journalists are in exile, right? They actually have an organization of all these journalists in exile. So if you contact Anna as well, Barcos, I will send you Anna's email as well because she's always open to that. But with MICT, you can't go wrong because they're a German-based entity. And so that linkage, that relevance of your work with our country, Germany, in the context of exile, I think MICT is your big go-to. Because if I was looking at it as an academic, your work should be relevant to the country where you are doing your scholarship as well as the theme. So start with MICT, I would say.
It's really funny because I'm in the board of the International Press Association in Nairobi, and we're the implementing partner for MICT for the project they do to support especially Sudanese journalists who are in exile in Nairobi. And I mean, a point is that it is super difficult for them to keep finding new media outlets because also a lot of like some media outlets founded themselves new and afresh while now in Nairobi, but then others have collapsed, and yeah, it's like it's a journey to find new publishing ways for journalists in exile, but it is super interesting to follow up.
Stalker. Oh, I will lastly add sembramedia.org. They have a directory of all media by continent. They purposely do independent media. And there are some that are in exile. So SEMBRA, sembramedia.org. You will see their database there, and you should be fine.
Thank you so much for that work well done. I just wanted to ask a question. I hope maybe you covered it already, but maybe it's something that you can shed more light on. The aspect of surprise. I mean, like when you went to the field and you're working on your story, what surprised you? What challenged you when you're working on your individual stories? Because I know there are challenges that can be generalized, but we can, because we have you here now, we can hear from you. What challenged you at individual level as you're processing the stories that you produced? Thank you.
That's a nice question, because I think the thing is that sometimes it's difficult, or like you come with a certain idea of a story also because obviously we read and we talk to people before we actually go to the field. So we have a kind of idea what we are going to find. And then you go and you often do find things that are a bit different. And then sometimes it is difficult to incorporate the complexities that you encounter. Because, for example, in the renewable energy story, in the aspect that was about off-grid solar solutions for schools, for health centers. And we had talked to the organization who's putting in place those solar panels, and they had referred us to 2 institutions. And then we got to the school, and the school was like, oh yeah, the solar panel hasn't been working for the last 4 months. And then we were like, okay, let's see how we can tell the story. But then it does tell the story about how important it is to not only put things in place, but also to think about maintenance and to think about how can something be sustainable and how can you not just come, make sure something is being set up, but then leave it to its own life. So kind of sometimes things happen and you're like, oh, okay, how am I going to report this? But then, yeah, finding a way of incorporating it. And then we went to the health center, and the solar cells were very well in use and powering fridges to cool vaccinations. And it was like, yeah, it's like, it was good to see that it's working, but it's also good to see that where the limitations are, and to not be blind about the limitations and to not ignore them, but to also talk about them, to see how a solution can be found in the future.
I think what surprised me with my story is how the story itself wrote the lead by itself. I always go to reporting just expecting the audience to do the work, the story, the sources to do the work. I'm not there to add myself into it. And what surprised me was when we were driving for, I think we drove for about 15 hours in total. So we're driving for 7 hours. And the person who sources the foodstuff starts talking Ukraine, Ukraine, Ukraine. I just keep hearing Ukraine, and I'm like, the fuck? Oh, sorry, are we allowed to swear here? I'm like, and I don't understand Wolof, right? But I immediately start recording her. Because how is it that I am sitting, I'm a Nigerian, sitting in somewhere on a remote road, way outside of Dakar, and I'm hearing Ukraine? That just showed us how connected we all are. Come to find out that they were increasing the prices of foodstuff because of the war in Ukraine. Foodstuff that was grown right inside there. And so that's how the beginning of that story started. Because I was like, I just recorded everything and then got someone to translate it. Another thing that surprised me was the level of savvy that an illiterate, and by illiterate I mean only non-literate in English. Because when people say the person is not literate, I'm like, yeah, just in English, your language. They are literate in their own language. But it shocked me that the level of data protection they went through. Now, somebody who doesn't know how to read or write in English and doesn't know how to write in their local language was actually using disappearing messages to send invoices. They made that technology work for them. And it inspired me so much, the level of wisdom that people do not ascribe. Just because we think, okay, the technology is in English and then it has no use. It's actually used for bookkeeping in Senegal. And so that surprised me. But at the same time, it reminded me that I must continue being awake to my own bias. Because bias is like food. Anybody can start eating it. Before you know, I don't, but yeah. So that was what surprised me. And yeah, that was a good question because it reminded me, oh, Ruona, you might be African, but you need to always be careful. Be careful, be careful. Be ready to learn, be ready to be shocked. And so that's what shocked me.
Yeah, and I think it's this thing of like being ready to learn and being like open and interested in the surprises and not being disturbed by them, but rather welcoming them and then trying to see what to do with them next.
So thank you very much. And I just want to underline what really you have done by going a bit against the general stereotypes in media about Africa, and by bringing out a very positive news from Africa. And your two papers really showed me how you have been able to show innovations in Africa. From Meyer, I was able to see, I would sum up in two kind of innovations which came from this paper. One is how they use the local product to make the baby porridge. So this was really, for me, something very interesting. And the other thing is how they insert themselves into the national market with the social media and also into the international market. And yesterday you were telling me that they are about to industrialize their industry. So this is these two way of telling the story. I think it shows us really that innovations also comes from Africa, and it is not always war, even if there is war in Africa. This is very important. And from you as well, I was very impressed by the article, and you made somewhere some comparison between Kenya, the production and consummation, I don't know, of green energy. And you made a comparison with Germany. So you see, Germany was way behind Kenya. It was somehow a kind of message to me that, Africa can be also a leading figure somewhere where people can take some examples. Because they are developing those kind of energies, green energies, and I find it really interesting. And so I don't know if I have questions, but I think I just wanted to praise your your papers.
There's something I would like to say to this, because I think what we both try in our work is kind of, it's not about positive reporting. It's about nuanced reporting. It's like, we'll not drop out the, like, you were talking about how Kenya is ahead of Germany, but then we would still mention that the Kenyan capacity of, Kenya is producing much less in total. Yeah, and it's important to say both. Like, to show that it's ahead, but also to show that it's catching up on another sector. And I think that's what sometimes is missing, this, like, putting things into context, that you can be ahead in certain sectors, and then there can be other points where you're catching up, and that Germany can be the one who is catching up and can be the one who's ahead in other sectors, and then Kenya is ahead in some sectors and catching up in other sectors, and then Senegal is ahead in some sectors and catching up in others. And it's like, yeah, kind of showing that the work people do on a daily basis, and as you were saying, it's like, for me it's also about, I mean, I've been living in Nairobi for 4 years, but still people who haven't visited can't really fathom. Although I send photos, I tell them, like, just in my circles, I tell them about how I play in orchestra, how I go to concerts, how I go to art exhibitions. But still, many people have a picture that is so strong of, like, I always say my life in Nairobi is like my life in Berlin. And people don't believe me. And I think that's like a lot to break, kind of this very cemented picture. A lot of people who grew up in Germany, who grew up in Europe, have in mind. And yeah, but like kind of one step at a time, trying to balance it out. And
I mean, I would say that some of that blame has to come on us as journalists that are German, that are in Germany, that are reporting on the continent. And this is why I'll give an example. In 2020, when COVID started, Lagos was going to start West Africa's first drive-through. Germany had done it already for about a month or 2 months. So I decided to do a compare and contrast. I spoke to, and this is where the academic behavior came in. So I had a set of questions and I asked both. The organizers had done it in Nigeria for 1 week. Germany had done it for a month running. So I asked them the same questions. How long does it take? What do you do? Blah, 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 blah. And when I finished, Nigeria really scored high on speed, hygiene, actually. But did not score high on privacy, like keeping the privacy. They had to use the police, for example. And then Germany used unmarked buildings. So compare and contrast. And what I did was send the article to the German doctor I'd spoken to, the association I'd spoken to, Association of Medical Doctors, and also sent it to the ones in Lagos. Germany came back to me and said, thank you so much. We learned a lot from Nigeria. We've actually put it in our newsletter that was going to serve the whole region of medical doctors. What that taught me was that they already have enough on their plate. They are not going to remember to check Lagos. If someone like me does not make the time to contribute meaningful, useful journalism that people can actually use, not just reporting anything that nobody can use. Immediately they acted on it, and I think I was talking to you this morning and saying that part of the problem we have is we take it for granted that Germans don't want to act as Africans. I know that. And then we also have the stereotype of Germany. And being in the middle, because yeah, I cannot go against, my husband is my family and my family is, so being in the middle, I've discovered that we need to also remember that sometimes these things happen and change doesn't happen because we have not spoken to the people we think should change. We have not provided them with the information. And I think that's where we as journalists have our work to do, yeah.
I don't know if we are taking over your role, if we are asking
Sorry.
questions to the audience, but I think at this point it's also interesting, like, where do you see yourself coming in? And where do you see yourself reaching out to journalists on your topics? Because I was talking to somebody who works for German Development Aid in Nairobi recently, and then I was like, so what's like the one thing that you think is interesting at the moment? And he was like, oh, we have so many interesting projects. And I was like, yes, I believe you, but maybe tell me about 1 or 2 now, because now we're here for 5 minutes, and I will probably not read the list of 200 projects on your website. I could, but I will probably do other things. And I think this is a thing also that happens a lot with me and people who are in academia, when I'm like, yeah, what's the one interesting thing you're working on at the moment? Oh, it's very difficult to narrow it down like this. And I don't know if I'm in a position to talk or if there's somebody else.
I'm going to defend the academics here.
Who is better suited. And I just want to ask you, how do you see journalists? How do you see yourself generally interacting? Have you interacted with journalists? How has it been? What can we do better?
How can we stop annoying you?
Yeah, how can we stop annoying each other, maybe? No, and because I think there's like lots to learn and lots of possibilities for synergies, but sometimes it's difficult to get to the point where the synergies are happening. And I think, maybe if we can somehow get ideas, that would be interesting.
I can say something now.
Nice.
Yeah, been too quiet for so long. But of course, we are happy that you're giving us all these details, and please feel free to talk as much as you want. Being journalists, you are meant to be wordy and explain. Actually, just to respond to what you're saying, how can we talk to each other as an academic? And when I read journalism and your articles particularly, I just want to say you do an extensive research work. And this is what academics basically do. So one of our points of convergence definitely is the fact that the research is extensive, detailed, and on top of that is not just collaborative research where you have core journalist writing, but you actually go to the field to report what you see and how you experience it. When you were talking about the example of Kenya, I was thinking Nairobi changes. Every time I fly to Nairobi, I notice after 4 months, things have completely changed. And I just wanted to know from your articles, how long did you do the research fieldwork? And how are you updating your data? Because I feel like life is just running along and things are changing. And you gave the example of the working solar panels. And I want to imagine that if they were not working 4 months ago, they probably were working by the time you were publishing the article. So I'm just curious, how do you keep up with the fast changing trends of development, and how do you document this? And also on top of that, if you actually do follow-up kind of, work after this?
It's a difficult bit. And I mean, journalism, I would say, but correct me, I would say journalism, it's more like you're looking at a specific point of time. So, I mean, for the green energy piece, I knew that I was doing the story, so I read articles and overviews and data and statistics and stuff, and then we had like 3 or 4 days where we were moving around and visiting the different people who are working in the field, and then you write with the state of things, and then especially magazines, they take time until they publish, but that's how they operate. It's like, okay, it's the stand of information at the time of the editorial process, and even if it's published a month later, they might not check every information again and update it. It's more like it's a kind of, how do you call it, like a view into the field at a specific point of time, kind of. And it's interesting because the story was republished this year, a month ago in another magazine, and there they were like, okay, is this number still correct? Is this number still correct? Like fact checking. But what, for example, they did not update, or we did not call everyone who's in the story, and we did not ask everyone how are things now to then update it. We did not do that. And about generally follow-up stories, it's nice once you get the chance to do a follow-up story at some point. And I mean, it does work sometimes that you work with someone for a story for a certain media house, and then maybe a year later you can come back to them because you're doing a different story, but where they also have expertise and you're doing it for a different media house or something. And it's always nice to build such relationships, because it's a relationship of trust, that you trust each other to be, that they trust us to be represented well in what they do, and we can trust them that they will support us with information. But yeah, I have the feeling that it's difficult doing many, many different stories all the time to actually keep track of what the people do that we once spoke to. But it would sometimes be great to have more capacity for that, to actually keep in touch and follow up more. But yeah.
I have a totally different approach, my friend. And again, I will say, I think that approach is informed by this background in investigative journalism, where when you are, well, it started as investigative journalism, but I think it's reinforced by the academic part of research that I get into. So as an investigative journalism in Africa, if you don't get your facts right, you're cooked. you are finished professionally. They are going to come for you. So you must check, double check. So that behavior informs every other type of reporting I do. With this particular story, it took me, I usually do pre-interviews, and I do them as if I'm doing the story, but to save costs, because I don't have money, I will do this virtually. So for example, when I decided, okay, I want to focus on these people, before I ever flew into Senegal, I had spontaneous WhatsApp interviews with them. So I will pick the day, you don't know when I'm going to call you. And this was like, so I will say it took me 6 months, because I can call you this month, I'll call you 3 weeks later, and you won't know the day. And I'll just say, okay, can you just put on video, take me around your farm? I want to see what's going on, and I want to see it spontaneously. And that really helps me to make sure they are not telling me lies when I get on the ground or afterwards. So I don't disturb them. I'm just be like, okay, put your phone there. And I'm taking notes, and I'm like, okay, do you want to go outside? And I'm counting things like the number of workers, the number of women who work, what they're doing, which is like ethnography, observation. You know, I found that really works for me. And then I get in. I spend at least 2 weeks. I don't like rushing things, because also you plan something and the person is like, sorry, I had to go for a funeral. What are you going to do? It's Africa. Now, this means sometimes I have to subsidize the funding I get, but I would rather not do a story than do it wrongly. I don't, because I cannot live with my conscience, basically. Everybody can say, oh, but my conscience, I'll nearly every day. So I sit down properly and I do the same things I was trying to do. Get the story and everything. What I do after that is I start calling, because you do a story now, it won't get published until maybe a few weeks later, or maybe a month or so, or over a month. But I call them all the time. And each time I interview somebody, I call it a numbers list. The data they give me, if it has to do with numbers, I must make sure I come back and ask them that. So if they say, oh, today I sent 6 invoices using WhatsApp, I'm like, okay, I need to ask you if you're still sending 6 invoices with WhatsApp on average by the time it's time to. I know that is not normal behavior. I know it takes more time, but as I said, it comes from, and that's where academia helps us as journalists. You guys can really help us, because I don't think I would be this meticulous if I hadn't been exposed to research methods. So I will ask who needs to be asked questions or whatever. And then when it's time, when we're nearing production, I call them. I do keep in touch, actually. Whether I'm publishing or not, I do keep in touch, which is how I know that they now have a factory. Based on the report, they used the report to get some funding. They now have a factory. I still speak to the lady who was talking about Ukraine. I still speak to the father who was interviewed from France. Like once in a while, I say hello. And I think that's just me. I don't like journalism that just interviews and goodbye. So the baby, Nathan, who was making noise in the web version, he was really noisy. Didn't let his father do this interview with me on WhatsApp. Had his birthday. And actually sent it, and the father was like, oh, you remember that? I'm like, of course. You know? So for me, that's how I engage with the story. I use digital methods to monitor, as I said. And I think that's one tip that I've shared with everybody I can. Try to monitor remotely. Try to be spontaneous. And, you know, you can actually observe a lot. You can do a lot of ethnography using WhatsApp.
May I? So, thank you. Excuse me. So, as a historian, I am asking myself what is really the definition or the definitions of journalism, because for me it would be related to the question of the monitoring, or I'm not talking about the veracity, which you have addressed very extensively, but what she has tried to answer. I don't know whether it's really the work of a journalist who is producing maybe daily or weekly or monthly to run after a late paper to update it with the times, and the times because we work also with papers, newspapers, so we can see as historian, this was published in this day, this was published in this day, this was published, so you can do a chronological analysis and see how things have evolved and so on. So this is why I think that I'm not quite sure whether, I think it is a picture of a situation in a given period in a place, and not running after it. Maybe everything has changed with digital media and everything. So this is my remark.
I think also a short, like there's so many different ways of doing journalism. And so one of my sources of income is working for a news agency. And news agency is quick, every day. And then there's a difference, like with stories that you do with time, where you actually spend a lot of time with protagonists. It is much easier to keep in touch because you had more space to make connection. But if you've, like,
But you can't keep changing it. You can't keep changing the story. Once it's published, it's done.
Yeah.
You can only try before.
Yeah.
But once it's published, it's done.
Hi, thank you for a really insightful conversation. To answer your question earlier on engagements with journalists as academics and experiences, I have a question that relates to the relationship between journalists and the editors, or what the editors, Redaktion, what's that in English? The editors, yeah. And there's an example last week in The Economist where a story came out about Ethiopia, Eritrea, and the digital version of the headline was Africa's Next War Looms. But the written version, the printed version, came out with the title, The Not Quite Peace Deal. And it's the same article with very different headlines. And it's so fascinating to see how online versions, just to attract readership, have this clickbait version of journalism. And it's a real issue that especially for academics who then trust journalists with our stories, and then we see these headlines that completely distort not the rest of the article, but the first impression, and then puts us in danger in one way. So just about that relationship between journalists and editors and different medias or different outlets that result in different audiences, I guess, that they expect, right? So.
I think for me, this part of the work I say journalists have to do. If you remember yesterday, one of the things I said was this award is an acknowledgement of the battles we fight. That's one of the battles we fight. I fight that battle as an African and as a human being, where you literally have to tell editors, you can't put this. Often people will say it is the search engine optimization, meaning that is how the audience goes to search. They will say Africa war. So they want to put Africa and war in the first 40 characters of the headline. Now, I always have to go, I understand that, but you will put the lives of the people who have gone on the record in jeopardy. I think what can work, because a lot of journalists do not know their responsibility extends to such. They don't even know what SEO is, to be honest. The only reason I know it is because I studied it at master's level. Yeah, that's the only reason. I'm not going to pretend as if I know everything. I think the onus is on academics to be very clear. A lot gets lost when you are not clear about what behavior you want to change. You have to be clear and say, please, even give the example. This headline usually changes because, to be honest, it's also in academia and journalism studies that headlines change, okay? Please make sure the headline does not change. In fact, if you need to write a statement for that journalist as a caveat, if the headline changes to anything inflammatory that may jeopardize me, you must not name me. Because you have the right to withdraw your consent to interview. I think you guys should also exercise that right, if you ask me. Because to be honest, I've seen a lot of harm done. So your question is a really serious one. And I feel if your life is at risk, you have to be clear. So that the journalist now makes the decision to either go and interview somebody or to stick to the terms of the interview. So that's not to say don't do interviews, but you should. One example, many examples exist in platforms of databases for academics. I'll stick to the African ones. There's SourceHeart, SOURSCE, URCE. There's Quote This Woman and Quote This Woman Plus. These are databases that have experts there. Of course, we also have the conversation. Now, what happens when you get on these databases is the academic, the expert, will tell you what their terms are, and you have to stick to it as a journalist. So I feel it goes both ways. Yes, we need to talk to our editors, but some of our editors are very stubborn, and some of our colleagues don't know. So it's you who is in the center of it that should try and educate us and say, this is the absolute limit, the line you must not cross. If you cross that line, I have it in writing, I can go after you. I can use it to defend myself too when people try to come for me. And I think that's what we should be looking at. Instead of not talking to journalists, talk to journalists, but be clear about what limits there are.
And even if like it's difficult to make that clear beforehand because you don't know what the headline is gonna be and stuff, but like print is difficult to change, obviously, once it's out, but online can always be changed. And media houses do change the online headlines. They're especially like, probably once a week there's like a Twitter little shitstorm on some media house or the other because they do like clickbait online headlines, and they do change it. And oftentimes it's a very weird dynamic, I think, because in like media houses, when online became a thing, they started to employ people who knew things about online, about the internet, but who were not good, or like who were not experts in journalism or experts on the topic. And somehow, to some degree, that has continued, where it's like they will employ somebody for social media because they know social media, but in the end, you have to know journalism. And then you can do social media, but you can't do social media and then also do a little bit of journalism on the side, kind of, if you're in a media house. And I think, yeah, to kind of what Ruona said, like there's a point in engaging and writing an email and being like, hey, I'm like, the article is super interesting and I'm happy that I was part of it, but that headline is a no-go. Or even as a reader, where you're like, I really enjoyed reading that article, it brought me a lot of information, but what the hell is that headline? I would suggest you change it. It's possible, and if nothing comes against the editors, why should they change it? Yeah. Right? I mean, and so I think, yeah, it's this this thing of engaging with media. I know it's, as a reader, we also have other things to do in our lives.
If you can't do it, just tell if you have a corporate communications department that handles these things, let them know. You know, someone has to be able to tell journalists that, look, this is my line. You know, instead of just cutting off the connections. Because as academics, your fears are valid, hey? We understand. But we do need to talk to you guys still. So I think you can have a policy. There are some organizations, some institutions that have a corporate comms policy, and they will tell, even though the individual has spoken to us, they will tell, you will get a follow-up email that says, look, this is and that removes I don't know if I should talk to you, my organization has not. So yeah, I think you can liaise with your organizations so you can say yes to our interviews.
So just a quick follow-up to these discussions. For sure, you've explained how you as a journalist can deal with the editors who are naughty or sometimes. But there's also the question of the story of the viper, like the person who funds your article. In many cases, they might also have interest in this matter. And perhaps that is also the reason why reporting on Africa sometimes has been looked at as stereotypical. Because, of course, people give out money in order that people report about Africa in certain ways. How would you deal with that? Maybe another follow-up question would be, also, once you've done your articles the way you've done, and they are very interesting ideas you brought out about Africa, do you also get a chance to speak back to the people you interview, the communities, you know, like they have something, and sometimes many of them are not aware of how helpful it is for them. Do you also have a chance to share this? Because I know for sure that once you've published, you may publish on the in the Economist, for instance, or you publish in the Times International, and this local community have their thing. Do you come back to them and say, look, this is what you're doing, and this is how we have seen it, and this is, you know, interesting, or this is okay?
Do you want to go?
Especially, I mean, because I write in German, I find it especially difficult talking with people, writing articles, but then, I mean, I can throw my article in DeepL and send them like a rough English version, but it's often difficult to kind of, yeah, this question of like, yeah, what's the relevance kind of, and that's why it's nice and interesting to work in actually teams and then have a story run in a Kenyan media house and have a story run in a German media house, so that the information that was gathered is actually available and accessible, not only for the German audience. That's an ideal case, but it's far from being the normal. Yeah. And generally it's like this going back and having a discussion again, it rarely happens, because that would mean you need to find budget again to go back to the same place. Often we are reporting from places where we are not, usually, or where we are just for a while, like a few weeks, and we might not even get a chance to get back to the place. We can talk to them, we can send them, I mean, it's good practice to send a link or a PDF of the story, but for me, it rarely goes further beyond that in like interacting about the content and then seeing, yeah.
This is always a personal, it's down to the person who's reporting the story, I think. For me, I will always, first of all, at source, I don't apply for grants that have conditions on countries that should not be reported on. Increasingly, grantors are very clear that we are not going to interfere, and they don't interfere. Which is why I'll continue to say, if you see stereotypes, it's often editors. I would not, grant organizations are too far removed. Where they influence is when they say, only report on such and such countries. Some US grants will actually tell you, do not report on countries that they have sanctions on. They will list the names. I don't go to those grants. I don't, because it's censorship. But for me, that's the only level of censorship you can really see. Any censorship you see, I feel, is in the editorial process. It's in the production process. It's more that. Nobody's going to come from one big founder and be policing single stories. Some of these grants cover up to 300 stories in Iran. You really think so? No. It's the editors. It's the colleagues. It's the reporters ourselves. So for me, I don't apply for conditional grants. I have nothing to do with grants that are conditional. That's my own personal decision, because I've decided how I want my career to be. The second thing I do is, when we start designing our story, I often try to push for multilingual publication at source. It doesn't matter whether we're collaborating or not. The main primary source, what language do they speak? So with this Senegal story, we published in French, we published in German, we published in English. I personally paid for Wolof translation that was sent to the people that were in the village. I personally paid somebody to voice a summary in Wolof and sent it as a voice note. Because I know that some of my sources they are not literate in English, French, or Wolof, but they listen. Now, did that take resources? Not a lot for somebody like me who is privileged, but it did. It took time. It took time. But the thing about me is, I make the time. I'm not saying everybody is going to do that. I don't encourage everybody to do it because it's a personal thing for me, you know. I'm not in journalism because, okay, let's just do the story and go. I'm not, because I've been like that. I come from poverty. I know what it is to be a source and nobody cares about you after, in quote. It's not, they are busy, they have their lives, but you're not thinking like that. You're thinking, okay, this person came to me. So I try not to do that. So these are the types of examples I do. I look at translation at source. And I think that's also where academics leave some of us. Some of the stories, some of the articles I quoted, the academics, they published in French. I don't understand French. So I wish they published this in English. So now I had to go and ask the academic if they had an English version. They did, but they didn't put it publicly. Why won't you do that? So if I didn't go and ask, for example. So I think where we can have some impact is, one, discourage conditional grants. Because the more people that don't apply for it, the more they stop applying those conditions. Secondly, multilingualism at source. Thirdly, multi-formats. So most of the time, journalism is in print. Whether it's PDF, you are still looking at print. Maybe we should try audio so that our people can send it by voice note, audio summaries. So that's what I do.
Very interesting.
Thank you. I'm not an academic, that's why I'm begging you to let me look away from the relationship between academics and journalists, okay? So the two gentlemen were just faster than I am, so sorry, I've answered the question partially. My question is about this relationship we have with, let's say, your audience. In my view, there is a kind of mutual impact between journalism and audience. So journalists report or write because they want to inform their audience, and on the other side we have the audience with expectations and journalists try to meet. Okay, so does it happen that you go after a story that because you think it's something that your audience would like to read about or hear about, or does it happen that you try to tell a story in such a way that meets the expectations of your audience? So, and obviously, how do you react when an editor says, I'm not really happy with this story because I think it won't be something that would interest the audience? Thank you.
So I don't have a filter when it comes to journalism. And so I tell the editor, I used to have a lot of arguments with editors about this. So I would tell the editor no, then the story would be killed, all my energy would have gone, the story wouldn't be told. So I now have a system. I blend the needs of the audience in the place, let's say Nigeria, Senegal, with the needs of the German audience that I know, because I live in Germany, I'm a news consumer, I follow the trends, I know what the audience wants. And then I blend it with the expectations of editors. Only at the level of World HIV Day is coming, World AIDS Day is coming, so let me do a story about widows, HIV widows, and let me do it in a way that interrogates German funding into Africa for HIV funding, so that I can blend all three. Now, I usually do not go and meet the editor first. I've stopped starting with the editors, because for me personally, it doesn't work. That's when we fight. they will tell you something. You actually go and do the story back, it can also change. And by that time, you've invested all that. So what I do, I take both the audiences, my audiences. And my audience in Germany also includes people, Africans in the diaspora. So I take what I think will be relevant to them. It's as simple as going on Instagram and checking Germans in blah, blah, blah. I'm also a member of up to 15 groups of Africans in Europe. I just join all of them. I listen. I don't post anything. I just listen to what they are saying, what they are sharing. So I know what's relevant to them. I know the editor is in the newsroom somewhere. They don't know. So I know. So I'm going to tell you what's going to happen at this point. So I then go, actually do reporting trips, and then come back and start pitching the stories. And that has worked for me. That has totally worked for me. At the very most, I have to go back again, maybe to update, maybe to fine-tune or whatever. But that is what has worked for me, because I discovered that when you start with the editor, you are starting with one person. You need to start with the audience, what they need, and then tie it with newsworthiness. An editor will never say no to a story when they need to fill their pages for World AIDS Day. They're not going to say no when they need to fill their pages for Remembrance Against Slavery. So what I started doing was targeting relevant dates, but starting with the priority of my audiences. And I think that's what people should try and do. You cannot be centering the editor when the editor is just one person in one newsroom somewhere. You have to start with what the audience wants and work your way up from there.
I'm still building my confidence to do that.
Oh, yeah, first place winner. You have the confidence. You have the confidence. Do it.
This award is contributing to my confidence to in future. No, yeah, I think it's a process of professional growth and growing into your career and making experiences with grants, with editors, and then trying to find your balance and to find your voice, the way you want to tell the story, and then find a way of getting it out without it being distorted somewhere on the way. But yeah, I think it's a process that continues.
It does. It continues.
Yeah, my question is about something that you've been touching upon throughout this conversation from the very beginning, and this is the topic of relationships and power hierarchies. You mentioned the relationships with the editors, the collaborative research that is on the rise, like in academia, so to say. And then I was wondering about your relationship and the power hierarchies you have to navigate in the field with your sources. Like, is it something that comes up often? Is it something you need to take into consideration often? You know, just the fact that you are someone coming from a different socioeconomic context, talking to people, how that influences your work in the field. Because it's also very relevant for us and as academics. Thanks.
I would say it is a really big thing. The thing is, in journalism, like I think in academia, there's a bit more of a context that is also pushing you to reflect your role. In journalism, it has to come from yourself. Like, no editor will be here and is like, have you reflected your white privilege lately? Like, that's just not a reality. So you have to and it's a good thing because you can make the effort, but it's also a bad thing because it depends on how much time you give it, like the reflection, yeah. So if you're in a very busy week or something, I might not reflect as much on my role as I would want to, and it is very difficult, and it's something that I don't have an answer to. I think it's extremely difficult to have conversations and to also reflect. Sometimes it's possible to reflect with the people we work with in the field. Sometimes there's not really space for that. A lot of times in reporting in Kenya, also in other places, money is an issue. a lot of the times it's like you as somebody who comes, or I as somebody who comes from a kind of settled, well-off socioeconomic situation, I am coming to somewhere where that's not the case for most people in certain stories, not in all stories. And then there's the question, what do you bring us? What are you leaving us with? And there's no single answer to that.
How do you usually handle that? I'm curious.
Yeah, it's super difficult. I mean, sometimes my preferred version of it is like, let's have a meal together. And I pay for the meal for all of us together who were involved in doing the story together. That's a nice thing because then we have food together, we have time to share. I'm not leaving anyone hungry on that day who might not have eaten or something and who came expecting something. In other cases, when sometimes people are quite straightforward. They already mentioned that on the phone. They're like, so is there any compensation? And then I'm like, straightforward, there's no compensation because I can't pay for stories. If I start paying for stories, all kinds of stories will come up and I don't know anymore, is this a story somebody told me because they will get money for it, or is this a story that is actually true? But it's a lot of conversation and negotiation, and sometimes there's no one solution for me for that yet. But if anybody has good suggestions on how to deal with that, they are very welcome, because it is super difficult. Yeah, and there's Patrick Gathara is a cartoonist in Kenya, and I was there's once a year there's the Africa Media Festival, and at the Africa Media Festival this year he said he was hosting a panel about kind of exactly like different roles in international reporting, and then he was talking about storytellers and story takers, and that was something that also made me think again, because especially when you're doing news, you are taking stories. You are not actually giving space for storytelling, because news, TV, 1 minute, you can't actually tell a story. You're taking a story to illustrate a news event or something. And I think it's important to keep reflecting and to keep exchanging with colleagues and with other people. But it is definitely a complicated thing, and if anybody has suggestions, they are welcome.
So for me, my experience, I journal normally, but then I now start to really, when I could find the words for it, I'll keep saying this because academia has really sharpened my journalism. I started finding the words for it, positionality, for example, what it was. And what I've noticed is when I report, I am othered. I'm othered based on my marital status. So some people will refer to me with more deference than usual. So I stopped wearing my wedding ring because I need you to come to me truly. Just imagine I'm not married, so that you don't come with that deference of madam, you know? Because I tested it, I wear a ring. Oh, madam, this way, please. Madam, they single you out of the crowd. No, she's a married woman, let her. And I'm like, these people were on the queue before me, So I'm othered. I'm othered as soon as I open my mouth. Because whatever accent this is, it comes out and they immediately say, so in Ghana, it's like Oberni, which is foreigner. And I'm black, like you, but I'm Oberni. And automatically, I know that that's going to affect positionality. I'm also othered because I'm an elite journalist. I'm a journalist, and literally, that's what the academic definition is. A journalist who is formally educated, who has some industry awards or whatever. And so I downplay that, actually. As much as possible, I downplay it. I tell the colleagues I'm working with, please, there's no anybody here. We won't get this story if you keep saying things like, this is my boss, this is my colleague, because I'm not your boss. I just need to get a true story here. So I have to negotiate it clearly and say, look, do not refer to me as Mrs. Meyer. Do not mention my surname even. Do not call me boss. I know it's culturally what you need to do. Do not call me that, you know. What I also notice is something that I discovered is called online shocks, where when you are doing an online interview with Zoom, there are power dynamics. So how I noticed the power dynamics is this. People would be commenting on my background because I have pictures on my background. People comment on things around my house. So I started hanging, covering it. Why? Because at the same time, it is proven scientifically that people will not talk to you as a journalist if you have a blood background. They don't trust you because who else are you hiding there? Especially investigative journalists. Who else are you hiding in the background? So I've had to learn that when I negotiate the hierarchies that show that, okay, it looks like this person lives in a nice house, I have to speak nice to them. I block it, you can't see it, but at the same time, I'm not blurring. I also have to prepare myself for online shocks because I know that dominance is asserted but in terms of dressing. Okay, some people will dress up suggestively. Some people even strip themselves on online so you need to be ready. You really need to be ready. And so for me, you won't see me wearing earrings. When I speak to Muslims, for example, African Muslims, I cover my head, even online. So these are the ways I'm negotiating the hierarchies. It's always a work in progress. And I don't think I would be this aware if I was not already reflecting on my positionality 4 years ago when I started the PhD, you know, and all of that. I think it's important to have a journal. I think it's important to debrief. So my version of debriefing is I have older colleagues that I really trust. I go on the field and I'm like, look, this person asked me for money. They were very hungry. They looked hungry, but I don't pay for stories. Am I a bad person? And then they talk you through, they say no. One time they told me, okay, you know what? The colleague you're working with that is on the ground. On the last day, when you are no longer there, after you have finished your interview, so they've given you the correct thing, you've already said you're not paying any money. On the last day, give the fixer money to give to that person after you have gone. Because you have gotten the true story and you have gone. But always start from the beginning like, I'm not paying you. I am not paying you even for lunch. I am not paying you for your transport. Do you want to talk to me so we get the story out? Okay, yes, I'll talk to you. And then they surprisingly get something later. They don't have to know it's from you even. So I wouldn't be this aware if I wasn't talking to senior colleagues, asking for their wisdom. How do you negotiate it? I feel guilty, you know. So I think that those are some of the things that have helped me, and this is what I experience in terms of power dynamics. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I'm very happy that you have completely destroyed our structure. Yeah. But you have destroyed it in such a creative way that we talked about all the points that we wanted to talk about. So we talked about audiences, we've talked about stereotypes, we've talked about best practices. I have another question because it really does look like that we share very many aspects in our respective work. And one issue that I oftentimes stumble upon, and I mean, you do investigative journalism, so this might perhaps be less attributed to your, I don't know the other works that you're doing, but the idea of sort of studying down, right, ethnographically, oftentimes there's a tendency in African study, in terms of social class, for instance, to get this idea of getting the voices. There's this whole debate about whether the subaltern can speak, whether sort of, you know, who gets the voice. But there's also the problem of, you know, that African elites or the upper middle class are not considered either accessible or not considered the sort of interesting in terms of how the image of Africa is portrayed, and that reproduces a very stereotypical image of Africa. So how do you deal with that also in terms of your reporting? How do you change that?
Yeah, it's a challenge because it's always like kind of what is interesting is that which is different. And then when people look at Nairobi, what is very different from Germany is the slums. But then what is actually like okay, 50% maybe of the Nairobi city population live like in informal settlements, but then the other 50% don't. And they also have a life and they do things, and it's nice when it actually works out to portray kind of different life realities. And I think in the energy story, we had, I mean, there's worlds in socioeconomic backgrounds between the people who we met for the story. Like the engineer who's doing the geothermal exploration prospects analysis is like highly educated, high up in a parastatal Kenyan company, and then the lady in the rural area who has a biogas at home, where she puts her cow dung and then she has gas for cooking, has a very different reality. And I think, yeah, it's kind of this finding like ways or finding things that are relevant to the people that we are talking to that are then relevant to the story, kind of. And not only trying to get some certain information out for illustration, but to actually find out, okay, why is it important for her to do what she does or to get her energy the way she gets it? Or is it important for her at all? I'm just trying to find that out and then trying to find a way to convey that.
So for me, I think in general, African studies has a lot to answer for in this equation. Why your question is very interesting is because often that's what African studies does. I've discovered that African studies often covers research along colonial lines. So German researchers will cover Namibia. This is not only African studies, it's happening in journalism studies and even journalism funding. So Germany funds a lot of Namibia programs. The UK funds a lot of Nigerian programs. Colonialism, okay? So it's not only African studies. But what I've discovered is the African elite are able to get away with a lot of things because African studies is still heavily focused on history. Heavily focused on, as you say, those below, meaning the contemporary problems and the bringers of the contemporary problems get out free. The focus we have on tribes of Africa, the focus we have on cinema of Africa, why are we not putting it in the contemporary business elites? Why are we not studying? And the history is important. But I want to see the same focus on what is happening now. You'll be hard-pressed to see studies, African studies, on Instagram, about TikTok, and the African subcultures there. Meanwhile, that is where far-right people are causing havoc, leaders. We have one of them from France, who has now gone back to Mali. And he started his movement from Instagram. He had to be evicted. I forget his name now. His passport was taken. France seized his passport. He has gone back to Mali. He's with the junta now. Thank you. Sorry. My geography is rusty. But I was in the region, right? For me, one of the people that actually brought him to something similar to research was actually a journalism NGO called Code for Africa. And the only reason this guy got any type of actual empirical scrutiny was because they were looking at disinformation spread by social media. Were they competent enough? Did they go far enough? I personally don't think so. because they are not the academics. So for me, my own way, how I try to counteract this is focus on contemporary things that are happening. Tech in Senegal, while still looking at the cultures, the media consumption cultures and patterns of farmers who consume orally, who use voice notes, who use disappearing messages. So I think there's a place to do both. The reason why African studies has sort of failed is because it continues to focus along colonial lines. It continues to focus on that tribal sentiment without taking into account that these tribes are moving. The Tuareg people we focus on, they are very, very good at using tech. They are some of the targets for Russian misinformation. Yes, because they're able to move. These people are recruited in places like Kenya, in the coastal cities, used for terrorism. We're not looking at this from this angle. And because of that, African elites get away with all sorts of things. Because we tend to focus on, we research down. And so for me, I think that's where journalism and African studies can come together. African studies can learn from how journalism looks at breaking news, contemporary cultures. But African studies has the benefit of being rich in corpus, rich in history, so able to link that history to the present, which is something us journalists lack.
I'm just excited about what you're talking about right now, because to me it already seems like a research project for a PhD that you're doing.
Oh my God.
So this actually makes me now curious. Which topics are you working on academically?
So academically, I'm working on power dynamics between African journalists that research on Western-funded collaborations with Western journalists. And we see a lot of that power rooted in colonialism. So for example, I've had to create a new power category because the theory does not cater to it historically. That power category is called control of cultural norms, where one journalist will decide the culture that we should cater to, we should fund is, for example, you can come to me and say, oh, this investigation is taking so much from me, I think I'm going to need a therapist. Oh yeah, sure. But the African cannot come and say, I need to say a sangoma for a spiritual cleansing ceremony, because they're going to be like, ha ha ha, what does that even mean? You know? So for me, that's the first thing I'm focusing on, making sure that the theory that exists is fitting into the contemporary reality. Another thing I think I will be working on, hopefully, is about how immigrants use what I call MIGfluencers, migration-focused social media influencers. They pay them. They even pay them, especially Africans. They pay them, and how do I know this? I have 3 siblings that have migrated in 5 years to Canada. And as soon as Canada started bringing out postgraduate work permit policy, you could see literally, even in our family, our little family WhatsApp group chat, the siblings moved away and were not posting official news sources. They started posting migration influencers. These are migration influencers that are paid to share a coupon from anything from far-right people, politicians, to universities. Nobody's looking at it. You know, so I feel African studies can start to blend what is happening in media cultures outside of mainstream, outside of cinemas, what's happening in the subcultures of social media, what's happening in the diaspora communities, and how does that link to our history? I think that can be a continuation of the work that exists. And yeah, I'm keen to explore. Let's go for it. And Kenya is a very important place, a very important indicator of all the shifts politically, geopolitically, culture-wise, media culture-wise, social media-wise. So yeah, I don't know what your thoughts are on this.
Yeah, it's when you were talking about like the migration influencers, a few Twitter accounts came to my mind of Kenyans who live in Germany and who give information on Twitter about how to go to Germany. And yeah, it's interesting because, I mean, Germany and Kenya just had this migration agreement, which is a bit of a populist farce for both governments. They use it in different ways, but it doesn't really change reality on the ground, but it has definitely been like a conversation opener, and more people are talking about how to migrate to Germany and giving advice, or yeah, it's definitely an interesting topic to study. If anybody needs contacts or a place to stay in Nairobi, welcome.
I think this is another question that perhaps I would like to ask before we unfortunately already have to close. In terms of data and contact, so I think there's a lot that we can share. Millions of things already came to my mind, even with regards to the two of you and I think this audience here. But perhaps structurally, do you think that there's a way in which information that academics or journalists are collecting can be shared, or is that something that you have experience on, or is it too sensitive? Because there are obviously also extremely important ethical questions when it comes to data. But this is one of the questions where, you know, one could ask, especially here in Bayreuth, is there something that we can do in order to enhance each other's work?
I was talking to, I forgot her name, Barbara? She just left? Is her name Barbara? Doris? I was talking to someone yesterday who works in the science communication in the university in Bayreuth, I think. Doris? Yeah, maybe. Sorry, confusing names. And I was saying that if I was working in the university communications department, I would like actively look for the contacts of journalists who do Africa reporting and come up with something like a newsletter with like relevant studies that are going on, that are going to be published around this and this time, because for us sometimes it is important to know beforehand when something is going to get published so that we can attach our research to a publishing date, or when something is happening, like, I don't know, protests in Kenya or a coup in Mali, or I don't know, whatever, to just be kind of proactive in like telling journalists that we have these experts. Because it is super like, there's a million universities in this world, and most of them have shitty websites, and so many people, and it's difficult to actually find out, or like sometimes it's difficult to find out who would actually be the good person to talk to. Then you reach out to the scientist or researcher, then they're like, I'm not sure if I can talk, then we need to talk back. Like, the process is often a bit slow when you want to talk like to universities, or like then you reach out to the press department and then they're like, we'll get back, and then they never get back. Things like that happen on a daily basis, and sometimes then we don't have the capacity to follow up, so we just go with someone we already know, and that will then the same voices get quoted again and again because they are available, because they are out there, because they make an effort. But yeah, there are so many more people with academic experience and knowledge whose perspectives could easily feature in journalistic stories and research, but yeah, sometimes it's not that easy. And I think, like, as after now, first thing I would do would be sharing a contact list of the jury and us journalists with each other, so that this little group of people, communication will be easy in the future. But yeah, that's just a very tiny starting point, but I think, yeah.
It's a great starting point. I think it's a great starting point. I have a list of things here. Because we have suffered.
Win the next prize.
I do. So I think there are many avenues for synergy, especially because of the prominent place that Bayreuth already has in terms of African studies and the whole cluster and the hundreds of fellows. So you already have that rich database already. I think you need to have a news agency mindset. So, for example, we've known for ages that the American election was going to happen. Proactively, your database should include sound bites already from the fellows, from the jury members that research on that. And when I say sound bites, I don't even mean just typed out. Read voice. And just put it up on your database. And those of us who are vetted, in quote, you can come up with whatever vetting system it means. Maybe Louis needs to recommend me, or you know how already from the prize, right? We now have to log in. So you're not, data protection, you're not just putting these things out. We have to log in, maybe get a token number to download. I think the biggest example you can use is UN Radio. They have stuff that journalists can just go and download, but of course you have to register. So if you guys look at UN Radio, you see how they run it. I think that's the first thing. We don't just need the contact numbers, because academics are busy people. We need proactive colleagues in communications or whatever that already prepare a news roster. So we get on there and we just take what we need. We ask for more context. You can decide to embargo it so that those of us who take some quotes, it's exclusive to us, and the rest of the outsiders can use the rest of the quotes for, I'm just saying. Okay? So I think, let's think of data as the richness of insights we already have. And let's tailor it to what we know is to come. So you need to ask each person in the cluster, what news events are coming up that are relevant to that you can speak to, and prepare ahead. Okay? I think you can also help us, those of us who are halfway into research, like two of us here. You can help us with things like getting ethical approval. Because I'll be honest, I want to do some things I've started as journalistic stories, but I feel they need academic treatment. But the whole stress of going to get ethical approval, I mean, I can come to you if the cluster has a means of getting ethical approval for independent researchers, then we co-author. I discuss with you, then we co-author. If you do that, then you will now see this synergy going quickly. The last thing I will say is, you need to have 2 short courses running in this cluster that will help with the synergies. And one is for journalists, how to research, or how academia can help your journalistic research. Because, for example, I'm not going to sit here and say all the brilliant things I said or the meaningful things I said came from nowhere or came from journalism. No, it came from my practice as an academic. That's how I know how to debrief, how to reflect. And if you guys teach us in a short course, it can be online, it can be a video that we click and we play. It can also be on-site, okay? Let me tell you, if you gave me that course 4 years ago, I will pay for it. I will pay for it because it has helped me. You know what I've learned? It shouldn't take me 4 years. So if you have a short course, you can get it funded too, because journalists don't have money. If you have a short course, bring journalists, that are interested in sharpening, in taking academic practices that will help them be better, how to verify, how to debrief. What does peer checking, what does member checking look like in journalism? That will help. And then you guys also need us to teach you how to convert your article into a news story. Because a lot of you, when we ask you to summarize, you don't know where to start. Now, when Birte was saying it, I understood. Because if you ask me to summarize, I cannot summarize. I want to tell you about everything. So I understand. But I think there needs to be a course that we will teach ourselves. This is how you get a story, even when you are doing the ethnography. For example, I can tell you immediately that this is the lead of my story. You might not be able to get that, but once we talk, I'm like, okay, that's what it means. So for me, I think we can talk, and we can also share resources. Like, I can share about how to use the conversation, because the conversation helps academics simplify their stuff into stories. I can tell you my experience of how we pitch to Columbia Journalism Review to turn research into, So if you bring different people like that into the room and we talk, you will make it easier when the next journalist comes, or easier for the comms person. So these are my ideas, and sorry for rambling, but yeah, thanks.
No, this is wonderful. I think in return, we might ask a few things from you, especially how to write better and to write to audiences in ways that they actually understand what we try to say. Because for me, at least in the past, I've turned more and more to journalistic works. You just write so much better than our ways of theorizing things sometimes get in the way of actually depicting situations and conditions. So yeah, I think we can have like a co-working space coming up. So we'll try to build on this and this engagement. Perhaps before I will give the word to Billy, and what I also found very interesting was this décalage, like the misfit between, you were talking about this, the two of you, about Nairobi changing so quickly, and in German audiences the idea of Africa is sort of the opposite of that. So we are really dealing with like a contradiction that is so profound, and that we are all, I think, struggling to sort of undo, but that also has a lot to do with yeah, perhaps society's unreadiness to give up stereotypes, and it will be, and to engage with ignorance as well. So I think what I also would like to sort of rephrase is what you said yesterday, that we also as individuals might want to target media houses whenever we see an article that does well or that does not well represent African phenomena. And so I also would like to thank you for all the wisdom that you shared with us, and the really inspiring work that you're doing, and we hope that we can build on this together. And we should stalk each other.
You have our contacts.
Brilliant. So.
Yes. No, I actually just wanted to say that Yoshka has really summarized what we've all done here today, exchanging ideas, and we hope to keep the conversation going. And I don't know if anybody in the crowd wants to say something. Perhaps yes? Yes.
Not content-wise to your conversation. No, it's not a contribution to the conversation that has taken place. It was just, I wanted to say a few thanking words. Thank you so much, Billion and Yoshka, to guide this conversation. And you also put a lot of work and effort in preparation, and I think it turned out into a really vivid conversation. And it was also a pleasure from our side to facilitate this event and to see how all of you have appreciated that this encounter actually took place. Thank you so much for making the time and contributing so much of your experiences, ideas and visions, and thanks for the jury. We have also appreciated so much that you've been here, and also very great thank to the team of Kulturhaus, Kunst und Kulturhaus 9,5. They are doing a very professional, great work here, and this on a voluntary basis. So thank you so much for accommodating us again and again, and we will probably every time come back here. So and please don't run away, because I got a phone call. The food is coming, so we can stay here for a while, 1-2 hours if you like. Please don't run away.
Is it warm food?
Partly.
Is
partly.
it?
I hope. Okay, thank you so much.
Yeah, I just want to extend my thanks to all the organizers here who have supported the jury for this work, organizing the whole things. So it has been a learning opportunity for all of us. And I think people who have come here are really happy with the work. And I just want to stress that, so that thank you very much to all of you, Nathalie and your team, and thank you.
Thank you, everyone, and enjoy the lunch.